Unit 7, Natural Selection, Lesson 2, Natural Selection Over Time. Objectives. In this section, you will organize data to support the claim that organisms with an advantageous heritable trait tend to increase in a population in proportion to organisms lacking this trait. Basically, what that means is just that if you have a trait that is going to be something that's going to help you survive and pass on your genetic material to offspring, then you're going to see more organisms with that trait versus without, because it does provide an advantage. Keywords: adaptation, a trait that gives the individual a survival advantage in a certain environment. Graph, a diagram that shows the relationship between two variables. Heritable trait, a trait that can be passed down genetically from parent to offspring. Melanistic gene frequency, the prevalence of a gene that codes for dark color. Natural selection, a process by which individuals that are better adapted to an environment survive better and reproduce more often. Natural selection over time. This little bird is a Galapagos finch. Does he look like an animal that changed the world? Natural selection is a process that was observed by Charles Darwin in the 1800s. Darwin was a naturalist, a scientist who specializes in the study of nature. He traveled around the world on his ship, the HMS Beagle. During this trip, one of the places he explored was the Galapagos Islands. The Galapagos are a volcanic island chain that sits far off the coast of Ecuador in South America. They are home to many unusual species of plant and animal life, including tortoises, giant iguanas, and many varieties of finch like the bird pictured above. Charles Darwin collected specimens of Galapagos wildlife to study, which led him to the explanation of natural selection. Natural selection is a process by which individuals that are better adapted to an environment survive better and reproduce more often. This causes the next generation to look more like these successful individuals. In natural selection, heritable traits, or traits that are inherited from parent to offspring that help organisms survive and reproduce, become more common in a population over each generation. There are four major parts of natural selection. Number one, overproduction and competition. There are more offspring born than the environment can support. This produces competition for limited resources in the ecosystem. I would like to note these are important. In your notes, make sure that you jot these down. Number two, genetic variation. There are naturally occurring variations in a population because of meiosis, which can create new allele combinations. Variation can also be introduced by mutations or changes in DNA. These mutations can be helpful to the organism by creating alleles of genes that give the organism a survival or reproductive advantage. 3. Selection. The organisms with most helpful traits that can find resources, food, water, mates, can survive and reproduce. Inheritance and adaptation. Traits are passed from parents to offspring. Some of these traits are beneficial and help the individual survive better and reproduce more often in the environment. These traits are known as adaptations, and they tend to accumulate in a population due to the environment and natural selection. You can see in the image here that white mice population is greater than dark mice population. Foxes eat the mice. Some mice are eaten by the fox. Now, the fox is going to eat whatever mouse it comes across. It's not going to choose particularly dark or light colored mice. White mice are more visible to the fox, thus white mice are eaten more. The surviving mice population, the surviving mice reproduce, and you will start to see a switch in or a change in the population, that you will see more darker mice because they are better adapted to blend into their environment. So the next generation contains higher number of dark mice. The dark mice have the advantage of being hard for the fox to see. What do you think would happen if they moved to a snowfield? An example of how natural selection takes place in an ecosystem can be seen in the diagram of the fox and mice above. At first, there are more mice with white fur than the mice with darker fur. The mice with the white fur are easier to see and are eaten by the fox. In the next generation, there are more mice with the darker fur. This is known as melanistic gene frequency, where a gene is present in a population that codes for dark color, like the darker fur in the mice population. This is easy to observe in animal populations for scientists to study natural selection. Some organisms appear to have genetic adaptations that make them more fearful around predators, have faster running speeds, or have more nurturing behavior toward their offspring. Anything that influences survival or reproduction is subject to natural selection. You can see here the graph with the beak depth for birds, that when there are drier years, such as in 1977, the surviving birds have longer beaks. When we have years that are more wet, we have fewer birds surviving with the longer beaks. The ones that are surviving are the shorter beaks. The vertical axis is labeled beak depth and ranges from 8 to 10.5 in increments of 0.5. The horizontal axis is labeled year and lists years from 1977 to 1984. The graph is a fluctuating line from 9.5 on the vertical axis to the right. The beak length is slightly higher for dry years and slightly smaller for wet years. A second example of natural selection at work can be observed in the same place where Darwin first studied animals on the Galapagos Islands. Two scientists, Rosemary and Peter Grant, studied the finches on the islands for a long period of time. The Grants learned a lot about the finch's beak morphology or beak shape. During times of drought on the island, the finches with larger beaks were able to eat the seeds available and survived. The following year, there were more larger beaked birds to reproduce, resulting in more offspring with larger beaks. The offspring inherited the genes for larger beaks from their parents, and in turn, these larger beaks gave these offspring an advantage since they were better able to utilize the food available on the island after the drought. Natural selection had caused an evolution in beak size that can be observed on the graph. Until recently, scientists believed that natural selection was entirely dependent on genetics. New research shows that there's more than just the makeup of genes in natural selection. The word epigenetics refers to changes in an organism that can't be explained by the sequence of its DNA. Epigenetics can be triggered by environmental events. Epigenetic changes can occur more quickly than genetic changes that take place through random mutations. This could possibly explain how quickly the finches on the Galapagos adapt to changes in their environment. Natural selection, like the finches, relies on both genetic and epigenetic adaptations. It's time to check in. Consider what you have learned about natural selection, then answer the following questions. Question number 1. Let's practice. Which of the following is not a trait that might be passed on through natural selection? Select the correct answer. A lizard who runs very quickly is less likely to be eaten by striking birds than lizards who are slower. A pale-colored moth is more difficult to see against white tree bark than a dark-colored moth. A chimpanzee uses a long twig to pull termite larvae out of a nest, catching food more effectively than chimps who use only their fingers. A giraffe with a longer neck can reach higher leaves in a tree than giraffes whose necks are shorter. Question number 2. The following table shows the average beak length for ground finches from the Galapagos Islands over 4 generations. Generation 1, 3.5 centimeters. Generation 2, 3.5 centimeters. Generation 3, 5.5 centimeters. And Generation 4, 7.5 centimeters. Based on this data and your understanding of natural selection, describe a scenario that would generate this data. A possible answer: during Generation 2, a drought on the island reduced the number of small seeds available to the finches and increased the number of large seeds. These larger seeds required larger beaks to crack them open. Because of this environmental shift, birds with smaller beaks died off due to lack of food, while birds with larger beaks were able to survive and reproduce. This led to more offspring with larger beaks. Based on the data from Generation 4, it appears that the drought is still ongoing at the end of the study. Some scientists have argued that humans do not undergo natural selection because of the technological nature of our societies. They believe that technologies that help humans survive their environments have stopped natural selection. For example, to survive harsh winters, the Arctic hare has evolved a thick, winter shedding coat, but humans who live in cold climates simply put on a coat. Use your creativity and critical thinking skills to answer the following questions. What technological advances would support the argument that natural selection no longer occurs in humans? Explain your reasoning. A possible answer: with the invention of agriculture, natural selection for speed in humans ceased to be an advantage. With the development of antibiotics, humans no longer require a robust immune system. Now, gene therapy means that even carrying genes that would formerly have been lethal in their expression is a mere nuisance condition that can be corrected. Every advance in human technology makes natural selection more irrelevant until it simply ceases to be a factor. Question number 2. A counter argument is that technological advances are examples of environmental factors that shape natural selection. Describe an example of a technological advancement that shapes but does not stop natural selection in humans. A possible answer: while technology increases the survival rates among human populations, within those populations, humans with certain genetic traits will still be favored over humans who lack them. All humans were helped by the discovery of antibiotics. But during antibiotics' early days, humans who were not allergic to penicillin survived bacterial diseases easier than humans who were. The traits that are favored in natural selection may change as technologies do, but technologies are environmental factors. They shape natural selection. They cannot supersede it. Natural selection over time. Learn about natural selection over time by watching the video, then complete the check-in and practice activities. You can pause the recording now so that you can watch the video. Check-in. Use your knowledge of natural selection to answer the following questions. Why would correlating melanistic gene expression to pollution be important? Pollution can darken buildings and trees, making dark-colored organisms more difficult to see. Because of this, the pollution creates an environment in which darker-colored organisms have a survival advantage. Since this relationship correlates in an inheritable trait to survive based on the environment, it creates a scenario to test natural selection. Question number 2. Why do you think charts, tables, and graphs would be especially important in the study of natural selection? Since natural selection can only be studied over a number of generations, gathering and tabulating data is essential. Charts, tables, and graphs let scientists observe patterns. For example, scientists see at a glance changes in populations and how they may correlate to changes in the environment. In addition, adding a graph over time lets any upward or downward trends become apparent, which helps scientists to know what correlations may be causal. Practice. The video leaves some information out of the story of the peppered moths. Consider what you know about natural selection and then use your critical thinking skills to fill in the details. One important factor in the sudden success of melanistic moths is not discussed in the video. What do you think that factor is? Melanistic moths became more successful because they were not as easy to see. The reason this drove their success is that being harder to see made them harder to eat. Predators saw the pale-colored moths more easily, so they were more likely to be eaten before they could produce offspring. Question number 2. Correlation is not always causation. The video implies a causal relationship between pollution and moth coloration. The following data shows various aspects about the peppered moth population over generations. Does this data support or not support the conclusion that moth coloration is caused by changes in predator eating patterns due to air pollution? Explain your reasoning. This data supports the causal relationship. Based on the trends in data, the tree coloration darkens over time. The air pollution increases over time, and the distribution of melanic moths in the peppered moth population increases over time. All other factors remain relatively constant. Natural selection over time. Maybe he's just thinking about science. Critical thinking, creativity, and interpreting data are important in making scientific breakthroughs. Scientists begin with a problem and then start thinking of different ways that it might be solved. Even finding some part of an answer can lead to different ways we think of and exist in the world. A heritable trait is a trait that can be passed down genetically from parent to offspring. In natural selection, heritable traits that help individuals survive and reproduce become more common in a population from one generation to the next. Natural selection is easy to trace in physical traits such as beak shape or coloration. But what about behaviors? Finches do not have natural predators on the Galapagos Islands. Darwin's finches evolved for thousands of years in an ecosystem where they were not hunted or eaten. The first humans to arrive on the Galapagos found an animal population with no fear of predators, and this was observed in their behavior. When Darwin visited, he could get close enough to a finch to throw his hat over it. When humans started to visit the islands, cats and rats that would stow away on ships changed the environment. By the mid-1800s, several Galapagos Islands had populations of invasive predators. Rats ate bird eggs, and cats ate the finches themselves. Graphs showed that finch populations decreased over time. This is typical in ecosystems since the indigenous wildlife has no adaptations that help to avoid the new predators, leaving them defenseless against them. For example, the following chart shows a typical pattern based on the scenario presented here. Based on the data, the introduction of the two predator species has reduced the overall abundance of all species in the ecosystem. During year 1, the species abundance was 1,200 total. By the end of year 4, there were only 570 individuals. This type of reduction in species abundance is common with the introduction of new predators. Zoologist Kyoku Gotanda decided to study the small ground finch populations on the islands. Gotanda found that finches on the islands, which currently hosted cats and rats, flew away when approached, even when the researcher was farther away than finches on islands which had never hosted predators. Birds who knew predators were wary, while birds who had never been hunted did not recognize the humans as potentially dangerous. Thanks to Kyoku Gotanda and her team, a better understanding of how adaptations to environmental changes are passed on through natural selection could help in the fight against extinction of the finches. On the Galapagos Islands, 4 of the islands now have permanent human settlements that vary in their degree of urbanization. For example, population size and density, town area, and light pollution. Now, Gotanda and her team is studying how urbanization affects anti-predator behavior in Darwin's finches, and together with her colleagues, she's also studying the link between microbiomes and immune function in urban and non-urban populations of Darwin's finches. Check-in. Practice thinking like a scientist to consider the fear response in Galapagos finches and how it could impact efforts to save them. Use your critical thinking skills to consider options and possible outcomes. What problems need to be solved? What knowledge do you need to solve it? What should you consider first? Do you have all the information that you need? Why would it be harder to identify an inherited trait that is a behavior instead of a physical trait? Behaviors can arise through environment, learning, or heredity and could be a combination of all those factors. The capacity to learn to read, for instance, may be something that is passed on through the genes. It is probably impossible to teach a goldfish, for instance, how to do it, but the ability is one that must be learned. This makes it difficult to be certain if an individual's behavior is hereditary. Some morphological traits, such as size, are influenced by the environment. A finch that starved as a hatchling will seldom grow up to be as large as one who has always received adequate nutrition. For the most part, though, physical traits are more easily seen as being passed from parent to offspring. Question number 2. What are other reasons besides natural selection that might cause the finches to show a fear response? The fear response might be passed on as a learned behavior from parents who learned it from their own parents, even though they themselves have never known predation. Also, cats are good at hiding. There might still be undiscovered predators on the islands. Practice. Use your critical thinking skills to answer the following questions. Question 1. The following data was collected from a Galapagos finch population over several generations. Based on the data, what could prevent or slow an adaptation in the finches back to pre-predator behavior? Possible answer: the energy and time cost of fear behavior may not be high enough to impact reproduction. Additionally, only 3 or 4 generations have elapsed since the first island was cleared of predators. It may be that not enough time has passed for a reversion to manifest. Do you think the change in fear behavior is genetic or epigenetic? Support your answer with information you found in the lesson or with independent research. Epigenetic, since predators had not spread to the islands until at least 1840, the finch's behavior changed in less than 2 centuries. Assuming a genetic mutation that causes a fear response arose in a single finch as soon as the predators arrived, that means that the single finch's descendants would have supplanted every other finch on the islands in under 200 years. Since Darwin's finches are still 14 distinct subspecies and are the same subspecies plus one that Darwin found when he visited, the change is almost certainly epigenetic. Genetic changes made by epigenetics occur quickly, while genetics tend to be slower. The finches have not reverted to pre-predatory behavior, suggesting that whatever is driving the adaptation may be slow acting. The research team studied only small ground finches. It is possible that a single mutation arose in a ground finch, which causes a specific set of behaviors and was passed on through natural selection to the entire small ground finch population. The change could be genetic. That is the end of this lesson. Good luck on your quick check assessment.